So I've just been working around the whole thing.
Hey again. All right. How's everyone doing? Good. Good. So yeah, kind of an open thing today. This is kind of like, we have class on Monday. I think we'll probably do things like casual, just Q&A and stuff like that. So this is kind of the last class where we have like real content, quote unquote, but I thought I'd leave it relatively open in case people have stuff they want to talk about. So if there's anything, either ask it now or I put it in the Slack channel or something like that. The other thing I thought would be cool, just because everyone's going to be standing by their stations during demo day, does anyone want to show off their projects? I think everyone should, and how they're doing and just like progress and stuff like that. Anyone interested? Go for it. Let's try to do it. If you can do it on my computer, that's amazing. If it's on Heroku, if not, okay, why don't you come up and then show it off. I'll let you do the thing.
So I got the domain. Have I seen the account?
Nice.
Hopefully it will work. Yeah, it just kind of takes a while to open it the first time. So it opens like this, and it just when you first open it, you'll have like trailers that I've selected personally playing. And what you need to do is, if you want to have a playlist of trailers of your own, you need to sign in. So, so the idea of this app is basically helping you decide what movie to watch, especially if you're in a group of people and you don't want to read synopsis and stuff like that. So what happens is you'll get options like this. These are custom-made genres. So for example, if you want to go for action, click on that. And it starts off, right now it's only playing trailers from 2015. So there's a lot of trailers that I still need to kind of figure out. Like for example, this looks like it's a wrong trailer. So you click here, and another trailer pops up. So what it does, it actually looks into the database of the movies and searches YouTube for that title. It finds one and it shows it to you. And while you're watching it, it searches for another one, so you don't have to wait. So this is like kind of a user-based filtering. Like you click here if it's the wrong trailer again. I probably need to add the title of the movie for you to know if this is the right trailer or not. You add it to watch list if you want to have like a list of movies that you want to watch, and you click on the poo if you don't want to watch this trailer again. What else? So the most interesting part about this is very different from other trailer websites, is that you don't have to go and look at what trailer you want to watch. It just kind of spits trailers at you. So for example, let's say you add this to watch list, it just plays another one for you. And if you ended up actually watching through the whole trailer, what it does, it just, once it's done, it loads the next one. Like that.
Super exciting. That's awesome.
So when you're a group of people and you want to decide on a movie and stuff like that, this is, I think, this will be pretty good. This one I'm not sure why. Maybe I still have to figure out some playlists, but should let's see. Yeah, it is playing the same trailer. You're right.
Yeah, there's like a limited amount of movies in that list.
So I need to figure that out. Let's try another genre.
So what did you, I noticed that movie. What was that movie again?
I'm not sure.
It's alright. It's Elevation between more.
So-
Oh, no, the one after that, I know.
So let's try comedy, for example. A Walk in the Woods. Again, oh, okay, there's a... Oh, you know what? Actually, yeah, I screwed up today. I think I know why this is happening. All right, you have your movie now. So I can fix it and we can check it later.
Let's go. Go to the next one. Can you go next? What's the next one?
Let's try.
I guess
Behold. God.
Oh, that sucks. It was working, but I don't know. I need to fix it, I guess. It looks like it's playing only 2 trailers. So
It's never time. It's never time. That's awesome. Like, what was like an interesting problem you had while you were working on this?
Well, the one that basically was the first way I saw I did this was that it loads the next trailer, but it has to refresh the whole page. So what we did is with the remote option, it basically loads the next page and waits until the trailer is finished. So it just loads that box itself. So the whole page doesn't have to load.
Cool.
And yeah, that's about it, I think. Also, the cool thing about the whole the remote option is that you can actually put it in full screen and it will load trailers for you without leaving the page. So that's pretty cool.
Sweet. All right. Good stuff. Anyone else want to reach out?
You got to show that we don't have a live on.
Yeah, no. You can plug in if you want.
Does it have like a adapter?
HDMI or just like one.
Yeah, okay.
Which one do you want?
Fireworks.
It's really hard to reach.
Oh, right. Okay, welcome to Book Buddies. It's a book club app. People can get together and create groups on books, have conversations about books they're reading together.
I guess there are oils more.
You can we use device, so you can log in, and
So you can create groups.
And then there's all the Vancouver people.
Header,
Very, very environmentalist.
books,
Want any oil?
and also the address for Google Maps, so you can like where your location is. I didn't know how to set where it needs to be west.
it's great.
And then books. Views, so you can have a discussion. Yeah, and my dog can't read, but for some reason she has a little bit.
So each group is on an invite basis, so you get, we set it up so you can send invite emails to other people, and they will click a link to be brought back to go through the registration, and once they register, they get added to the group automatically, as you can see all the group members are added on the left. And they will have access to all the books inside of that particular group, and have privileges to like comment on things. And so inside the book you can see different people can comment on them. And you can only delete your own comments, which is really good.
And you can also add it to your favorites. So this is add to my favorite. Top of that, and then it'll show it. Good stuff. That will show it on your groups listing page.
And those favorites are links that will link directly to the book, so you don't have to go through the process of going to the group and then finding the book. You'll just go right to it.
Even though we also.
So, marking sweet target, obviously. We're getting there.
That's super slick. That's awesome. Any like interesting challenges you guys have?
I think so many challenges. Yeah, everything.
I had a lot of trouble with the email invites. That was like a 2-week-long ordeal until you hung with it. But I was really happy with how seamlessly it works now. Like, send so quickly, and it makes the sign-up process like super easy. And also, if you're already a member, you don't actually have to do anything. It just sends you an email that says you've been added to this group because you're already a member of Book Buddies. Which is cool.
Awesome stuff, guys. Anyone else? Number 3? Yes, no?
We fell on it.
That's okay. It's like, this isn't like demo day. This is within class. So.
Okay, alright.
Do you need, are you on localhost or Heroku?
Yeah,
Okay.
should have There's the alright, let's give me super bare bones. Super bare bones because it's bare bones. Okay, cool. Okay, yeah, because these are actually supposed to be images. For debugging purposes, it's paid to find an image every time I click on something. So these are basically the idea behind our application is actually Uzo describes it best. Why don't you describe it?
So our application is a place where people can go if they want to borrow or lend something. Basically, users will have items waiting to be borrowed, and people can just hop on and be like, oh, you know what? We should really get a karaoke machine for our party, and then you can find a karaoke machine and it's right every weekend. So it can be tools or anything like that. So that's basically what we're going for with this. It's kind of like Airbnb, but with your stuff.
Yeah, so the idea is that people can, they can go to buy stuff, again, it has like, product, and then image, category. We'll have some more fields here, again, progress. Category, and then and then the idea is that it'll be, we have some GeoKit APIs so they can set their locations, and then when they look for items, the items in your close location, prioritize those and show how long it will take theoretically to get to them. And for some reason it's not locating the, oh, it got the bugs. It did locate it, but it didn't populate the field. Usually it says where I am. So it didn't know. That was our complication, was figuring out geolocate.
Yeah. What gem did you guys end up using for that?
GeoKit-Rails.
For that one.
Yeah, it works so far pretty well.
Yeah, it's pretty accurate.
Yeah.
It's like 2 houses from where you live.
Yeah, at home it was off by 2. At the office it was off. It was 115 Peter Street or something like that. So no, that's it. Still super bare bones. Got a long weekend.
All right, good stuff. Anyone else, or is that
Lots of all that.
all right? I won't force anyone. So yeah, a couple things I want to go over today. I definitely wanted to go over Heroku deployment again really quickly because we kind of sped through that, and I did add a cheat sheet for what you need to do with that. I'm going to go over React and Rails really quickly. We're trying to keep things not super complicated, and I found an easier way to do it that doesn't involve like NPM and all that craziness. The gem we were using, React on Rails, is good and great. It's just more complicated. And I would say for what you guys are doing right now, you're totally fine using the way I'm going to show you today. Is there anything else people want to go over today? Anything people are finding confusing, or just questions and answers, or those sorts of things?
APIs, client and server.
APIs, client and server, like specifically just.
What you try to cover. We kind of spent through.
Okay, so we could talk about APIs a little bit, so we'll add that to the list. You're talking about when you want to create your own API.
Yes.
Okay, sure. Cool. Okay, so let's talk about Heroku, first of all. So I added a cheat sheet to the notes, basically how to deploy it to Heroku. And really there's only, like for the most part, it's really, really simple. There's just a couple things that you need to know before you deploy your app to Heroku. And this is where things tend to get a little bit on the complicated side. Problem number one is that Heroku really, really, really pretty much requires that you're using Postgres as your database. And we've been using a different database. We haven't had to think too much about what database we're using, but we've been using something called SQLite. And SQLite is exactly what it sounds like. It's a really simple database that's great for development purposes, not necessarily the best thing in the world for like production applications. So Heroku has kind of built everything around Postgres, where Postgres is like a fully featured, high scale, blah, blah, blah database that can do everything, right? So in order to get anything up onto Heroku, probably the biggest obstacle you'll encounter is that the Rails apps that you've been making so far are not used. Number one, so I'm just going to go into my Hackblog application, but again, you guys don't necessarily need to follow with this, just follow the cheat sheet. Actually, I don't need to go to the Hackblog. The easiest way to do it is when you start off any project. If you know you're going to push to Heroku, and you know that you're okay using Postgres, you can actually have your app running using Postgres in development. So that is definitely an option. And the way that you do that is just when you start off your application, you'd say Rails new application name, same way we've always done it. And then you supply, there's an option for this. So I can say -- database equals PostgreSQL, right? When you do that, Rails will configure your application to use Postgres locally. In order for that to work, you need to, and it will give you instructions in the database YAML. Actually, I'll just show you this. So I'm just going to say Rails new sample database PostgreSQL. That's going to configure everything to use Postgres. It's not necessarily going to install Postgres on your system. And I think maybe we had gone over this, but if we didn't, basically the only other step you need to do is, and you only have to do this once for a computer, right? You don't need to do this every time you set up a Rails application. You just need to say brew install PostgreSQL. And that will basically, I already have it installed, so I get in there. That will basically install it to your system so that you can use it. When you do this, you're going to see some instructions in there. Read through them. Basically, the most important part is it's going to give you a line of code to copy and paste to make sure that Postgres is always running on your computer. So this is basically if you want to be using Postgres for your local environment as well as on Heroku, and you're starting a brand new Rails application. I would personally, there's nothing wrong with SQLite. If you have Postgres, it's probably not a bad idea to start using it. You're not really going to run into too many problems, but there's some slight differences between SQLite and Postgres where if you're using one in development and one in production, you could potentially run into issues with them. Like the most common one I've seen is, remember when we were doing searching and we were using those like operators where we said like title, like, whatever? That is case insensitive in SQLite and case sensitive in Postgres, which can cause problems, right? So that's the easiest way. I'm starting a brand new application. I can just say Rails new, app name, -- database equals PostgreSQL, right? Unfortunately, you guys probably already have apps developed, right? And you can't start a brand new application or that would be annoying. And then you kind of have two other options that you can do. Number one, you could have it so that in development you're using SQLite and in production you're using Postgres. And the way that you do that, and this is what we've shown you before, but just to go over it again, and this is again in the cheat sheet. Basically what you need to do is you need to modify your gem file. Say I only want to use Postgres in production and I only want to use SQLite in development. If you don't do this, if Heroku sees gem SQLite 3 anywhere in your gem file, it will complain. Unless it's like specifically says, I only want to use this in development, right? So what you need to do here is you basically need to restrict SQLite 3 so it's only running when you're in development, which basically means development's like I'm working on it, it's on my local computer. Production means Heroku. They're like the environments that your Rails app runs on. So here I would say group development do gem SQLite 3. And actually, sorry, one other thing you'd want to put in here is you want to put development, test. And test is when you're running unit tests. So you want that to be under SQLite 3 as well. And then Postgres, you would say group production to PG is the Postgres gem, right? So by having PG here, you're saying I want to use Postgres as my database adapter, right? This way totally works. Like I said, you might occasionally run into incompatibility problems, but it's probably the simplest way to do things. There is a bit more like administration and stuff to think about when you're using Postgres. So SQLite 3 is definitely easier to use. But yeah, this works in most cases. And then once you have this, from a database perspective, you're fine to push to Heroku. Any questions on that? Does that all make sense? Cool. Option number 3 is I have an existing Rails app and I want to migrate it to work under Postgres completely, right? So in that case, I'm not going to do the group thing. I'm just going to tell my Rails app through the gem file that I just want to use Postgres universally. So here I'm just going to say gem PG. So I've eliminated SQLite. I'm saying SQLite is no longer a part of my project. I'm only using PG. So that is the only gem that is going to be installed, and I'd probably get rid of this comment as well, or modify it. And then when I bundle, I'm no longer going to have support for SQLite inside my Rails application, but I would have support for Postgres in my Rails application. There is, if you're doing this, one additional step that you need to do. So remember that the gem file really is just saying, these are the dependencies of my application. These are the libraries I want to have available to me when my application starts. So when I add stuff like Paperclip, it's there so I can use it, et cetera, right? Once I've done this, I've told Rails that SQLite is no longer a dependency of my application. I don't need SQLite. And I've added Postgres as a dependency of my application. So I need functionality for Postgres to be available. There is one extra thing you need to do. So Rails stores information on the database that you're using inside a file called, in the config directory, called database.yml. And this stores information on, here's the database names I want you to use. You can store settings like the username and password I want to use to log in. There's a bunch of advanced options you could do, like how many connections you want to allow to the database, all kinds of stuff like that. But the default Rails application is configured to set up databases with SQLite. If you generated a new Rails app from scratch, like if I go into that one I just made, I think I called it sample, and I went into config database.yaml. If I started with Postgres, Rails is going to put a database.yaml that makes sense for Postgres into that file, right? But if I have an existing application, Rails has already generated that file, so it's going to talk about SQLite. So you need to modify this to support Postgres. And I put one way, there's a bunch of different things in here, but for the most part, one way to do it, I put a sample into the cheat sheet. But one way to do it is actually generate a new Rails application, just kind of copy and paste this, and change your database names to match the application name, right? So you could just kind of take this, paste it into your thing that's using SQLite, and then just like modify the names of the database right here so it matches your application name. So I'd say like hackblog here. Then I can modify this to say hackblog. And this is just basically telling it, once I connect to Postgres, this is a database I should use for my different environments. And I'd modify this to be hackblog as well. What? Yeah?
Question about that. So if you want to do both, let's say if you set it up to do local SQL,
SQLite and
would you just do production?
Yeah, so that's
production.
That's kind of a weird quirk about Heroku. Heroku is going to override your database YAML. So if you're on Heroku, no matter how you're doing this with all three options, the settings you have inside production in your database.yaml file are completely irrelevant. Heroku is going to override them and inject its own stuff, right? So that the good news about that is if you're using SQLite locally and Postgres in production, you don't have to worry about this because it's going to override it anyway. If you want to use Postgres locally, you need to make sure this is configured to use Postgres. So 3 options: brand new Rails app, you can use //Postgres if you want to use Postgres on development as well as on production. If you have an existing app, either set it up so that the SQLite gem is only loaded in development and test, and the Postgres gem is loaded in production, or change it so that you have only gem PG and you don't have gem SQLite, and modify your database YAML to tell it that you're using Postgres. And I would say copy and paste the sample that's in the cheat sheet in terms of like a starting point for your database.yaml file, because some of the settings are different. You can't just change the word adapter from SQLite to Postgres. It won't work, right? You need to make sure you have some of these settings. Like, for example, this school setting is something that wouldn't be relevant for SQLite 3. There's other stuff like, if you look at the database in SQLite 3, it's going to be like a file name, whereas in Postgres, it's actually going to be just a name of a database. So you want to make sure all that stuff is consistent. Everyone with me so far? So step 1, hardest part, make sure you're configured to use Postgres in some capacity on production. And you have a bunch of options for that. So I'm going to leave this. One other thing I should mention. If you've gone with this third option and you've changed things over to use Postgres, all the records that you've created so far, all of that stuff is not going to be available to you anymore because you've changed the database that you're using, right? All of your data is stored inside SQLite 3, and now you've moved over to Postgres. So once you've done this, you basically need to sort of reinitialize your database. Let me go into Hackblog here. So I would actually have to say, once I've changed this, so I've changed that, I'm going to say bundle to basically install Postgres. And I would need to reset up my database. And I can do that by just typing rake db migrate. Nope. Oh, I have a stupid rake problem.
I think we all have this.
I'll talk about that in a second. Okay. Sorry, what you need to do when you switch over the database is, I'll talk about bundle exec in a second, is run, the easiest way to do this is run rake db setup. You have 2 options. You can run rake db setup, which basically just means get my database set up in the state that it's supposed to be in, which creates your database, as well as sort of loads the schema of your database, so loads all the tables in place. Otherwise, you can do rake db create, and then followed by rake db migrate. I would recommend using rake db setup whenever you change your database, because that's going to be the quickest and most effective way to do it. The thing about migrations is they're really good when you're trying to get from like 2 migrations ago to now. When you're trying to run through the entire history of your project, that can actually get a little slow to run through every migration piece by piece. Rake db setup is going to take a shortcut. It's basically going to say, here's what my tables are supposed to look like. I'm just going to create that without going one by one through each one of my migrations. So when I run rake db setup, you'll see that will just take a couple seconds and it's good to go. If I had run rake db migrate, and this was a big project, that could potentially take a couple minutes. Cool? Let me talk about bundle exec. So you might notice when you run rake sometimes, this is really annoying. You might even see it with Rails. It's a possibility that you would see it with Rails. There's other various things that you might see it with. You'll get this error that says you've already activated rake 11. The version numbers don't matter. You might see different version numbers. Basically what this is you're going to run into this situation when you created a Rails app, and at the point you created the Rails app, let's say the version of rake that Rails app was created against was 10.5.0. And since then, a new version of rake has been released, and you've created a newer Rails project that's using that newer version, right? Gems, like libraries in Ruby, are stored globally, right? You have a directory somewhere on your computer that's basically, here's all of my gems, right? And whenever I type in the word rake, or I type in the word Rails, or I type in anything on the command line that's like an executable that corresponds with a gem, what Ruby is doing is it's finding the latest version of Rake and running that. The problem is, when you built this project, it was using an older version of Rake. Rails is basically warning you and saying like, hey, I don't know if you want me to do this because like there's a newer version, or you said that this was supposed to be against Rake 10 and now this is running under Rake 11. So something bad might happen, right? Whenever you run into these problems, you have kind of two ways to solve them. Number one, you can always put bundle exec in front of any command that you run on the command line that, of course, basically Rake or Rails, right? So anytime I'm running Rake or anytime I'm running Rails, I can put bundle exec in front of it. And basically what that means is make sure that I'm running the version of Rake that corresponds to the version that's in my gemfile.log, right? So if I did this, you can set up, I'm basically saying make sure that you use version 10 of Rake rather than version 11. If I just type Rake, it's going to use version 11, right? Your other option is to say bundle update. When I say bundle update, remember that's going to go and it's going to make sure that I'm using the latest version of every gem. So normally, if I say bundle install, it's going to stay like locked on a version because it's going to use what's in my gemfile.lock. When I say bundle update, it basically means ignore my gemfile.lock and grab the latest versions of everything. That sometimes takes a bit. But usually when I do bundle update, I can go back to just using Rake. So kind of common problem, a bit of a pain in the ass. There's some people who will say you should run bundle exec in front of everything to do with Rails. Like anytime you run it, run bundle exec in front because it's safer. I find it annoying, so I prefer to keep things up to date. But one of those two options works.
So does that update the Rake in the app?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so if you say bundle update, now we're using a newer version of Rake in the app. Now, Rake is something that like generally doesn't change all that much, so it's a pretty safe thing to update, but you do have to be careful. Anytime you run bundle update, you're running newer versions of code. You're running with different versions of the libraries than what you've used previously. So there's always a chance, anytime you run this, that things might break. So you do have to be a little bit careful with bundle update. Just basically test through things. Ruby gems are generally pretty good about not introducing a bunch of breaking changes, but sometimes it does happen. So safest option is put bundle exec in front of it, but you can always do bundle update as well. Does that make sense? Definitely an annoying problem. Some people go as far as like aliasing Rake to bundle exec Rake. So anytime you type Rake, you're actually typing bundle exec Rake, which you can do. There's a file you can set up to set up aliases called like bash profile or something like that. You can look it up. But yeah, those are your two options there. Any questions on that? Yeah. There's no downside. There's no downside whatsoever to using bundle exec, other than you have to type 2 more words every time that you type something.
Or you can just alias it to.
Yeah, so let me show you the alias trick really quickly. So inside your home directory, you can go to your home directory by saying cd ampersand. There's a file called .bash_profile. I'm really bad about bash scripting, so I'll probably screw this up. Can I make an alias? I never do this, but some people do.
It's basketball colored.
Yeah.
Alias, what you want it to be. And then, no, like, not, I don't need equals, quotes, whatever you want to.
Basically, you could do something like this. If writing bundle exec is really annoying, some people will alias that to BE, where now once I've done that inside my bash profile, I can just type in like BE Rails or BE Rake. I think you can also do this, where you could say alias Rails is equal to bundle exec Rails.
Yeah.
Or you could say alias Rake is equal to bundle exec break. And once you've done that, you can just use Rails break and you know you're going to use the bundle exec version without really needing to think about it. So a couple options there.
You have to, if you're doing this, you have to also restart your
Terminal, yeah.
once you save also.
Oh, sorry, yeah. I use Nano. You can open that file as long as you open .bash_profile. That's the key file. I'm using something called Nano, which is like a command line text editor. It's not magical though. You could open this in Sublime, and that would be totally fine. I'm not going to save that because I don't trust aliases.
Where is this file located?
What is it? Sorry?
You said you can open it from Sublime.
Yeah, so if I wanted to open it Sublime, I would just go open, and then I'd find my home directory, right? So that's going to be like users Ryan in my case. And how do I see hidden files? Yeah, if I have that set up. Yeah, I don't think everyone will have Sublime command line though. Okay, we're gonna figure this out together. Finder.
You have to do a bunch of crazy stuff in the defaults.
Really?
And it's not crazy. Well, Finder application utilities.
Oh, yeah, this is a pain.
Hello, user friend.
I think what you can do, I have a feeling this might work. Okay, so that's why I use Nano here to do hidden files. The other thing you could probably do is you could open your home directory in Sublime, and then Sublime itself will show hidden files, right? So if I open the Ryan directory, I can see my hidden files here, and then I can go to my bash profile, right? And what this is, if you're curious, this is just a script written in Bash, which is like a scripting language that your terminal uses, that whenever you open up the terminal window, it just runs the script. Cool. All right, so back to Heroku. So far we've set up Postgres, right? So step one is make sure that you're using Postgres in production in some capacity. Step two is there is a particular gem that you want to have on when you're pushing something to Heroku. So this is the last like setup step for things. And it's called Rails_12 factor. So this isn't strictly necessary with Heroku. You'll find that it will work. You can push to Heroku without having this in here. The one thing you'll notice that doesn't work is if you don't have this gem, your Heroku logs won't work properly. Because this does a few different things, but basically Heroku has this like concept that they follow called 12-factor apps, right? And it's a bunch of different things that they say, like if you're making a well-architected app, this is what you should be doing. You can look it up, like 12-factor applications. Rails does almost all of them, and there's a couple things it doesn't do by default. And this gem basically just makes Rails do all of those things. And specifically, the things that it does is it does a few things with assets that allows Rails to serve those assets. The main thing that you care about for Heroku is it outputs errors to just like the terminal, kind of, right? Like it outputs them to what's called standard out rather than logging them to a file. So Rails by default, in production mode, will log all of its errors to, or log all of its log information to a file. Rails 12-factor will make it just log out to the terminal, basically, which Heroku expects you to do. So once we've done that, and we bundle, that is basically, that's all the setup steps you need to worry about in order to get things set up for Heroku. So once you've done that, there's really only one thing you need to do after that, which is basically just actually push it to Heroku. So the first time, if you've never set up the Heroku app before, You need to download the Heroku tool belt. So if you go to Heroku.com, download the tool belt, it'll install it to your system, and that will make available a command called Heroku, right? And anything you need to do with Heroku, you can do through this. Creating a new app, I would just say Heroku create, and I'd give it a name. So the name is basically what you're going to refer to when you go to like blah.herokuapp.com. So if I made this RB hack blog, and it would be rbhackblog.herokuapp.com. If it's the first time that you've done this, it'll ask you to log in. You would just use your Heroku credentials in there. If you have done it before, it will just automatically do it. So it will show you, okay, I've created this HTTPS rbhackblog.herokuapp.com. If I was to go to that right now, I wouldn't see anything. Or I'd see welcome to your new app. So my application isn't actually up there yet. So the way that Heroku works is, you'll notice the second thing here is like a Git repository, right? It's like a Git URL. And Heroku works by basically setting up a Git repository that sits on Heroku, the same way that you have one that sits on GitHub. And anytime you need to push anything to Heroku, it's as easy as pushing it to GitHub. So step one, you'd want to sort of commit everything. So you'd want to be in a clean state. Setting up Heroku. And then once you have that, you could just push to the Heroku repository. So you would use git push. Now, with GitHub, you usually just need to say git push, and that's it. With Heroku, because it's not sort of your default repository that you're pushing to, you have to give it the name of the repository that you want to push to, which by default is going to be Heroku, right? So you just put Heroku in there, and then what branch you want to push to. And this is always going to be master. You want to make sure Heroku is aligned with your master branch and not other branches. It's possible to push other branches to Heroku, but I would say that's generally not a good idea. And once I do that, it's going to push it. So you'll see the normal things that you see when you're pushing to GitHub. And then you'll get this extra stuff here where it's talking about, it's basically setting up your app for you. So it's doing a bundle install on Heroku side, getting everything set up, getting all your assets set up, et cetera, et cetera. Heroku is really smart. It will figure out that you're a Rails app. It will figure out what your gem file is. It will basically get everything good to go for you. And hopefully everything works okay. So far, so good. You'll get a couple warnings. One of them is you haven't set up a Ruby version in your gem file. You can actually tell Heroku which version of Ruby you want to use. This is generally not super, super relevant unless you're using like kind of like advanced Ruby functionality or you're using newer features, where you can actually say in your gem file, I think you just Ruby and the version, so 2.2.4, let's say, right? And that might be important just to make sure that you're using the same Ruby version on Heroku as on your local computer, just in case you run into weird incompatibilities or something like that. It's not required, but it's something that you might want to think about. The other thing is no proc file detected. This one you don't need to worry about as much. If you get into like background tasks and stuff like that, like when we talked about backgrounding, we use Sucker Punch. You don't need to worry about it with Sucker Punch, but if you were using like Sidekick or something like that, you might need to set up something called a proc file, which basically lays out, here's how all my background tasks work. And Heroku has really good documentation on that. And hopefully everything's set up. So now we've pushed all our code to Heroku. It's set up all of our gems. It's basically good to go. There's one extra step you need to do. Yeah.
The SQLite got set up. Is the SQLite
Well, that was the whole first step, right? You need to make sure that.
I know, but I think it's the wrong gem. Because SQLite's not working.
Oh, just gem SQLite.
Yeah, like it's a SQLite.
Is that still like free?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, it is.
That's set up.
There is one last step you need to do with Heroku, which is you need to separately migrate everything on Heroku. So migrating on your, like, Heroku has a completely different database than your local computer, which is a good thing. You want that, right? You don't want all of your test data to live on Heroku. You want actual production data. And you can like mess around on your own computer and know that you're not screwing things up for people who are actually using your site. What that means, though, is anything you change about your database, the same way if you were pairing with someone and you kind of gave new code to them, they need to run RakeDB migrate. That also needs to happen on Heroku. And the way that you do that is you just type Heroku run RakeDB migrate. And Heroku run is basically a way of sort of running something on the command line of your Heroku run. You can run anything on there. You can run Heroku run Rails console. You can run Heroku run bash even to get like a command prompt. Any rake task, anything like that. You generally wouldn't want to do things that modify files, and you wouldn't run like a Rails server because Heroku's going to do that for you. But once I run that, that's going to connect to my application. Takes a few minutes, and we're good to go. So if I refresh this, and I go to /posts, why am I getting a 404? Oh, let's learn something new. Let's learn how to read logs on Heroku. If you ever need to see logs to see what's going wrong, you can say Heroku logs -t. And Heroku, basically the -t option means that it's going to stay connected and it's going to continue to show logs as you run things. So I'll make this a bit smaller so we can see it. When I refresh the app here, you can see things actually changing. And it says no route matches get /. Oh, you know what? Sorry, I just want to see. So this was a sample thing that I created that doesn't actually have controllers, but you would be able to route to your actual controllers in this case. Okay? So that's the steps. Number one, make sure you're running Postgres in some capacity on production or in production. If you want to run it in development too, that's definitely an option. Number two, install Rails 12 factor. Number three, Heroku create, and then git push Heroku. From then on, you just need to type git push Heroku, and always remember you have to run RakeDB migrate on Heroku every time you push something. Cool. Any questions on that? Yeah.
What's the best way to deal with when you have multiple that's on the project and you want to create a repository? You want to push what you have to create a repository to Heroku?
You mean like should I push from GitHub to Heroku?
I guess that's what I'm asking. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, yes, right? So if you think about, when you have multiple people working, everyone, your upstream repository is always GitHub, and everyone has their local versions of the repository. If you're using the command line stuff, you are technically pushing from your own computer, right? Which means that you do kind of have to be careful. If you push something and meanwhile there were other changes on GitHub, you could potentially put your app in kind of a weird state. Because it's a Git repository, it's relatively smart. If you had some commits and you tried to push it, and then Jess had some other commits and she tried to push, you would kind of get an error because Heroku would realize that you're trying to push something that doesn't have some of the commits that I already know about, so it would give you a bit of an error about that. But ideally, you'd be pushing from GitHub. Heroku does have stuff to support that. I think they call it like channels or something. Yeah. There's definitely a way to do it where every time your master branch changes on GitHub, it will automatically deploy to Heroku. Yeah, so if you go to the Heroku, like Heroku.com and go to your application, you can basically set it up to connect to GitHub, right? So you would enter your credentials. Once you've done that, you never have to worry about pushing ever again. It will sort of automatically do it for you. Obviously, that carries some risk because now every time you push to master, it's going to get deployed. So you have to be a bit more careful with your master branch at that point. But yeah, that's definitely an option and probably the preferred way to do it. Like, there's nothing wrong with doing it from the command line, but it gets kind of unwieldy in a hurry. Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for dealing with stuff, data that you already have in SQLite to pull it easily into Postgres when you're migrating from SQLite?
Like when you want to migrate from one to the other. Yeah, that's a really good question. Off the top of my head, there's something called a dump that you can do, which basically means create like a SQLite or a SQL script that contains all of the information from my SQLite database. So you would dump it from your SQLite database, and then you would run that script on your Postgres database, right? I think those should be compatible. So basically what you can do is from SQLite 3, so I think you can get to a command line by going SQLite 3. Is there a BB dump? Is there one? Sorry? Anyone know how to exit this? Nope. Okay, so okay, there we go. Control C always works. Let's see if there's a rake task. Okay, this is weird. I'm just going to go into my sample one. RakeDB. No, because schema dump will basically, what that does is it takes the structure of your database, so all of the tables and the columns, but not the data, and it puts it into the schema.rb file. Normally, you never need to directly run that, but every time you run a migration, that actually runs. Yeah, I think it's something you'd have to do directly from SQLite 3. So you can go to the SQLite 3 console by typing SQLite 3. You can type .dump and your table name, or your, sorry, database name. That'll give you a big SQLite script that gives you all the stuff. Actually, though, it doesn't really. That's a good question. I'll have to figure out an answer for that. There used to be a gem called Taps that did that kind of stuff. I haven't used it in a long time.
I was just looking at it.
Okay.
I wasn't able to use it. That's a good one.
Yeah. So look into a gem called Taps. I can double check it, but it should do that. I don't know off the top of my head though. Anything else about Heroku and kind of doing that push and stuff like that? Yeah.
I have a question. So the way it works now, I'm guessing that when users have new input into tables, it's just one table that kind of says, okay, this is the user number one has these inputs, user number two has this, but they're all in one table. Is it possible to have like each user has a table that's completely separate?
Did you get it?
Yes. Yeah. I
For
mean.
example, if it's a very sensitive information,
Yeah.
you kind of don't want transactions popping.
Yes, so there are options for that, right? Generally speaking, when you're talking about something like that, it would be called like multi-tenancy is sort of the idea behind that. And basically what that means is you have one application, multiple users are using that application, and you want them to all have completely segregated data, right? And that segregation is, you know, varying levels of strength. So the simplest version of multi-tenancy is probably what you're talking about, where you have a table and everyone's information is all co-located, but then, for example, you'd have a user ID column, and this would be user IDs 1's thing, this would be user ID 2's, this would be user ID 3's, and basically anytime you're collecting something, you want to make sure you're collecting it specifically for that user ID, right? That's called like scoping, and it's kind of the simplest version of multi-tenancy. There are gems even to help with that. So I'm gonna show you a site called Ruby Toolbox, and it's actually a really good resource if you're looking for gems. And it gives you kind of like here's all different categories of gems. And you can find sort of popular gems in that category. So I'm going to search for multi-tenancy. One of the problems is you kind of need to know the name of what you're looking for. So multi-tenancy, I would say the most popular one that does sort of the scoping thing. So this is going to add support so that you're still having the user ID columns, but basically it's going to ensure that it automatically makes sure that it's only selecting from the appropriate user ID, even though you still only have one table. Access tenant is probably the best example of doing that. If you want like more hardcore sharding where you actually have completely different tables for each different user, the most popular gem you could use is called Apartment. I actually released Apartment, the first version of Apartment, and Influitive maintains it. That was like not a pitch, but you can see it is officially the most popular one. And what Apartment does is it uses something called Postgres schemas. You can use it with SQLite 3 as well. But basically, it creates essentially completely different databases for each one of your users, and it does it in a way that's relatively scalable. It can get a little hairy when you get into like the thousands of databases, because migrations have to run separately against each one of those tenants, you would call them. But Apartment is definitely a good option if you want. That's like industrial grade security, I would say. You can get a long way with just doing the scoping style of multi-tenancy. But if you want the crazy industrial grade, Apartment is the thing you want to use.
And what happens exactly, like, once you get to a lot of databases, like, what kind of problems?
So basically, the way the Apartment works is there's something in Postgres called schemas, right? And schemas are almost like sub-databases, right? So I'm going to have my database called, app name _ production. And then inside that, I'm going to have a bunch of schemas. And anytime I'm using Postgres, that's true. It's just normally, everything is going to be inside a schema called public, right? With Apartment, it's going to create a separate schema for every one of your users, or every one of your tenants, however you define that. So in Influitive's example, we'll have different customers of ours, and each one of them will have their own database. So we'd have, like, MongoDB would have their own schema, and it would have the entire application set of tables replicated in there, right? And then if we had another, Salesforce or something would have also their own schema, and it would have all of the tables in there. That works pretty well. The biggest problems you run into when you're using this is you end up having quite a lot of tables, right? Because you're going to have essentially a copy of your schema for every one of the schemas that you're using in Postgres. So you can run into weird performance issues with Postgres if it gets very, very large. We've also discovered a few bugs in Rails as part of that, where Rails has some memory issues when you run into giant numbers of schemas. The other problem is when you're migrating, you have to individually run a migration for every one of your users, which can get a bit slow. But it works. Plenty of people use it in production every day, so yeah, it is an option. Very good point. So .m, Heroku will ignore it. If there's anything you are using in .m, you have to separately configure it in Heroku. And the way that you do that is by using Heroku config:/add, right? You type in the name of the variable. So I'd say my var. I'm just going to go back to Hackblog because that's actually a Heroku app. Heroku config:/add. My var, so that would be whatever happens to be inside your .m file. I think you put equals, right? Yeah. And then the value. And Heroku will add that. It will restart your application, all of that. I think you could say config list. No, maybe just config. Yeah, just config, and it will show you all of the ones that it already has configured. Trying to think of other Heroku stuff. I mean, there's obviously a lot to Heroku, but that's kind of the basics of getting things up and running. Yeah. So we're right at 7:30. Why don't we do a little break, and then we can talk about APIs a bit. We can talk about react really briefly. I know it was kind of like brain exploding last time, but I want to kind of show you how it works with Rails, and I found an easy way to do it. And other than that, if anyone thinks of anything else, we can talk about it for sure. We'll try to get some final project time as well. Ooh. That would be so one of the reasons you like that is, yeah, we have you can see that yeah, you don't if you're a developer, essentially learning so step one, again, actually, you know what? I'll go to there. Just go ahead.
Oh, if it's there, then
It's pretty simple. Organization is pretty nice. Basically, most of it is just biggest thing is you have to decide how to react, which tenant is accessible, right? Generally speaking, the way most common way to do that is every tenant will have its own subdomain. So there we go. So if you do that, you just want to use subdomain.
so it's not to
no, because what it needs to do, right? It needs to figure out. Right? Generally, like I pushed up yes, yeah, generally I pushed nothing as fast as this. Each one has so they have It's kind of it's the most popular. That is kind of like the gold standard. That's
Yeah. Yeah. But I don't know if it's so like.
Applications.
Yeah. I mean, more things. Yeah.
Respond to them. So let's take a look. So usually right? It needs something that works. So tell me how. So whatever belongs to the person not is always coming, right? Yes. Or has one, but yes. Here you're going to have let's call it last name. Right? Once you do that, you don't have a government. Same term. So first of all,
What's your test of this? Sometimes you want this wrong. Like this.
It's possible. Trying to make those documentation. It's like this. Then document all lowercase combination. And dot.
I think it's
Trying to fix the
small.
No, yeah, I'm just trying to scroll it.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so that's like.
There's a way to
And read all that. And I don't really remember.
Will both work or if there's no controller?
Yeah.
It's some it's not.
Yeah, there's another way. I'm not sure. There's one for you.
What's the post here?
It means like you're basically simulating.
Oh,
Yeah. Let me just try to figure out. Yeah, it's actually, it should be something else. All lowercase. And then it will take you around. So we have posts, and then we get this. In this case, you're what you post on. So
Slack.
Right. And then the second parameter is you don't even need it.
So working. Yeah, it's like your
This is where it gets so bumping up against the intensity of it stuff, right? So this is tricky. You need
It was already created, you had to do one setup, not migrating. It's a brand new database, so it's already created for this last year. Cool, that's it.
So you're saying that the point is not that discussed. That's where we and like no preference for the user is involved.
That's a user model. Like how do you say that?
Yes, that is implies that.
It's just the device is defined. So that's the one case. That one is all complex. That's sort of short. Oh.
Yeah. Oh, no.
You initialize that. Just do your scouts.
First thing you want to do is unload that.
Oh, you can. It's funny how things come. Yeah. Yeah.
It is? What time?
Yeah, it's great class. Yeah, so.
I'm just gonna do
Do it, yeah. It's like. It's a variable.
I hate this weather. It makes me so depressed. I'm like, here, Jen. It might do like when you open it, so be careful. Smells like ginger. Right? It's good. I think the simpler the better. Like the original, you know?
Yeah.
Obviously. Did you like it? Have a glass. Take a glass.
If you don't want to go, you want to more.
Or you barely speaking.
Yes, you have educated the same way. Money. So any person do something. I put the exclamation on after it. It's just it's basically means that this is actually something. And you have to think about which actors. You already have something for the index. Because the index is minimal, so as long as that, I would say it's really should. Every single action, it's component. Security secure and description stuff. And you put whatever. You're already on this. Right? It's actually. So you already have that.
And I'm going to do something and say, so basically what you're doing is you're saying they're not supposed to see it. Well, so the thing is, because this is where actually, so it's kind of almost really set. Right, and you're only. Oh, I see.
Have you had the chance of watching Microsoft build a conference that they have?
I have to go to the
Me neither, but this was actually pretty interesting. They're going like into boxes and box APIs. I program their own bot that would work with AI. And you can have conversations with this bot through like WhatsApp, Skype.
That's actually like the big thing. It's like the big thing. See you at the success.
Always.
Potentially be better. That's like, okay, we'll figure out this one. Right, or yeah, that's it.
I'm not saying people because like Domino's they had it installed as a button or showing, so you can order a pizza and say what you want, and the one will ask you like you want this, you want that, what are you? The programming is that, like you don't need a programmer to do something. Say, it's all like driving around. Like the small businesses. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, yeah. All right, it's like focus.
You need some resources where we can go to like learn.
Yeah.
React is awesome. Yeah. Okay. I'm just looking at it. Yeah. Okay. I've been using this. Yeah, I think of it like instead of your Rails asking, when you want to find out what's in your React section, that's the React Rails. React components on this page, or you have like a single page JavaScript application that interacts with your Rails and just adds an API. So you just like return JSON for all your visitors, and then you just like call the API, do it index calls, or you're
most of the habits are good, but I wish this fun interface was like more interactive.
Yeah.
It's nice to just like
Yeah.
with the app rather than it's for sure it's about saying like higher odds and it's a little bit of
Yeah, I mean, it does get more complicated when you do that too, especially if you account learning. So you have to like do back router, you have to like learn, like things in history and all that stuff.
and then if you want to actually be like consider friendly,
Yeah.
it's more
Oh yeah. So a good way to get into it is just the React Rails and just like ties your.
I mean, there's definitely like everyone is like see JavaScript nowadays, so a lot of the apps.
Yeah. Just this. Yeah. You get into like problems too. You're just like, how does this to work? Like, it's a very like server-side thing I'm trying to do. So it's to like pass all data and then bring it back. So sometimes it is easier. But yeah, React.
We want to do a quick show of hands. It feels like people are doing kind of projects, and I don't want to keep you guys with content, but I also don't want to keep you guys doing projects. You guys want to do. So maybe a quick show of hands of how many people want to learn more stuff today? How many people want to see kind of projects? So maybe
I put my hand off the boat, so.
okay, and specifically, you know, you guys came up, we could keep going down, just how to React and Rails. I feel like that was too far last time. Does anyone have any ideas? Do you want to do that? Let me quickly go into that, and that's going to tie into the API stuff as well.
Okay.
So let's just quickly cover both of those. Or let me quickly cover both of those. Yeah. Cool. So I gave you a very complicated way to do React last time called React on Rails. It is a good gem. It is useful. Here's the way I would think of it. If you are creating a project where you want your entire project to be like a single page application and every piece of content is rendered via JavaScript, React on Rails is probably the best thing to use, but it is very complicated. As we saw like a little bit of, it sort of involves NPM, it involves the Rails application kind of being restructured in a way. There's a lot to kind of cover. If you want to dip your toes into React, which I recommend all of you guys start with, and specifically what that might be is, think of your application as more or less working the same. You're still rendering out ERB files, but you have that one area where, you know, most of my, like, for example, like with Reddit's project, you know, most of your stuff, like setting up your profile and like listing off genres and all that, Rails works fine. But when you want to start to do stuff like, I want to advance trailers and all that kind of stuff, like JavaScript starts playing more and more of a role, and it would be nice to use something that organizes things a bit better. What I would recommend is use Rails for 90% of your project, and then use React where it makes sense, as opposed to my entire application is React and Rails is just sort of an API server. That's for sure a valid thing to do, but it's kind of jumping into the deep end. So we're going to show you a simpler approach where you can just kind of pepper your application with React where you want to and keep it as Rails for the rest of it. So I'm going to create a very simple sample application and just kind of walk through this with you. If you want to follow along, great. If not, I will push this up to GitHub so you have a reference to it after the class. So we're going to use a gem called React-Rails as opposed to React on Rails. React Rails as opposed to React on Rails, it basically tries to work with Rails as much as it can. React on Rails is basically like, throw away the asset pipeline. This is how you're doing development now. React Rails is basically, we're going to keep most stuff the same. We're going to do just the minimum necessary to get React to work in your application. So probably a better starting point.
I like your hair like
That's
that.
something I was playing around with, so I'm just going to delete it and create it again. So I'm going to create a brand new project.
Yeah, I know. I had them for a while, and when it rained, oh my god, when they
Just so you
got
can see
wet,
how it works. So I'm going to say Rails new.
terrible. No, it's like this, but sometimes when it's too humid, it gets kind of fuzzy, you know, like weird.
Once that's set up,
Today it wasn't too much.
I'm gonna
I
go
was
into that
impressed,
directory.
but-
I had a hat on, or this.
Oh yeah,
Like this.
yeah,
It's
it's
like,
yeah. It's
And
definitely
I'm going to add React
Right.
dash Rails gem. So I'm going to open that up. And in my gem file,
are we going, Jen?
I'm going to say gem React Rails. Save that. Ignore my purchase warning.
Yeah, it's gonna need that.
Bundle. I will install React Rails. And this is similar to React on Rails, that it's kind of a two-step process. Number one, I put it in my gem file. Number two, there's going to be a new Rails generator for me. So again, if you want to see all the Rails generators, you could just type Rails generate without anything else after it. And it will show you all the generators that exist in your project. And you'll notice that we have two new ones. We have React component and React install. So we want to run React install first. And basically what this is going to do is it is going to set up our project to use React Rails. And if you remember React on Rails, it did a billion things when we ran that. This one is doing very, very simple things. It's creating a directory where React components are going to live. And it's modifying our application.js to include React and include that components directory. So really, really simple, not a lot happening here. And if I go into the actual application, you'll notice I don't have crazy client directories or anything. I just, if I go to app assets JavaScripts, which is the same asset pipeline that we know and love, I have this new folder called components. You'll notice I have stuff like channels. Just ignore that. I happen to be on Rails 5. And you can see in here, I'm requiring React, I'm requiring React Vue.js, and I'm requiring components. That's all the changes that's made. So it's basically gotten stuff set up for us. And we're going to create a really, really simple to-do app. And I'm just going to show you how that works. And in order to do that, before I do anything, I'm going to set up the Rails side. So remember, I recommend this approach if you kind of have a working Rails application and you want to like pepper a little bit of React in it. So I'm going to create a scaffold just to do something really cheap and quick for my to-do items. So I'm going to say Rails generate scaffold. It's a bit bigger. I call it to-do. And to-dos are going to have completed Boolean. So I'm going to say completed Boolean. And they're going to have a name, right? So really, really simple to-dos. That's kind of all there is to them. When I hit enter, that's going to generate my views, my controllers, all of my stuff. I have, at this point, a working to-do application. If I ran Rails server, and I go to my app, and I run break-db migrate. Hatchkey, yep. So that's created my to-dos. And if I go to /to-dos here, I don't know why this is. I have the world's worst and ugliest to-do application. So I'm going to create a couple to-dos just to show you how this works. This is obviously not great, right? But it is functional. So let's say I wanted something that's a little bit more interactive. I want to have checkboxes right here. I want to have it when they check off. I want it to automatically complete things for me. So we're going to set this up. Hopefully it'll be less confusing this time. But so far we have a working application, right? The other nice thing about scaffolds is we have, anytime you do Rails generate scaffold, you have a working API, which is awesome, right? So if I said todos.json, as opposed to just to-dos. So remember, anytime I put .json at the end of something, I'm kind of overriding the format that I'm expecting from Rails. So normally when you send a request from a web browser, your web browser is going to send that one header. Can anyone remember what that was called? The header that specifies what format you want things in? Accept, right? So normally when you send a request from your browser to Rails, The accept header is going to include, I would prefer HTML if you have it. If I put todos.json, I'm overriding that and I'm saying, actually, I want you to give me JSON. And scaffolds already know how to handle that. So if I say todos.json, I am going to get the JSON representation of all of my to-do items, right? So I already have a working API. Sorry? Oh, do they look less fancy? Yeah, so I use I use a Chrome extension called
JSON.
how do I get to that?
Modified
Settings?
JSON.
More tools, yeah. JSON view, and all that does is anytime you render JSON, it makes it look fancy. So if I were to disable that and refresh it, I would get a very ugly version, but I'm getting the same information, right? It's just less fancy. But I'm going to enable that because I like things that look good. So now I'm getting my JSON representation. Just to talk about how that works, let's just actually dig into the scaffolds that Rails created for us. The main thing that you need to know, okay,
Sweet potato?
Yeah.
they're doing it in a different way.
Is it almost
I
ready?
don't really
Like, should it be?
No, it's not. It's pretty hard still.
Okay.
But it's been in there
Let's
for
talk.
a while.
Basically what's happening
Where are you
this is
going?
probably similar next action
Where?
that you would write yourself. You're getting your variables, your instance variables together. So if you're rendering like an HTML view, this is basically
Wait,
how
to where?
controller
It's
action
like
looks. You
Oh,
initialize-
like the umbrellas.
This is where people to-dos, set that to do dot,
What
right?
if you come back
Um,
to screen?
Normally, if I just have that,
There's
if I'm not
one
saying
outside
render
and
or
one-
redirect,
The one outside is a
is-
little bit.
what's going to happen with this index action? Like, what is going to get rendered out to the screen?
Snails? What is that?
Forgetting about APIs, just
Oh. Yeah, not my favorite.
She's like,
Yeah, but you can keep that for yourself.
It's going to render out of view, right? So it's going to go to app, views, to-dos, and it's going to look for something that has
See,
the action name, which is index. It's going to look for
Yeah.
the format, which is HTML,
learning.
and it's going to look for the processor.
Oh, it's just another programming language. It's just the
Okay.
last class, so
Right? So this is the view that got
it's
rendered. This is kind of the
well.
way that we've always done our views.
fancy.
Scaffolds by default will also
Yeah.
create a view
Tomorrow I'll be
with
more
JSON
sociable.
format, and it will use JBuilder.
I'll see you tomorrow.
I don't use this very often, but just so you know, this is what's happening. You can look up JBuilder and how it works, but it's basically like a DSL, domain-specific language. So basically a way of shortcutting, here's how to generate JSON for a particular item. The way that I prefer to render JSON from a controller is using respond to. So this is the kind of key method anytime you want your app to work like an API, right? And the format is always like this. You basically say respond to do format, and then you list off all the formats that you want to respond to. So it's a format.html. I want to be able to respond to HTML. If someone loads this controller action from a web browser, I want to do something. And I would say format.json, right? If you don't put anything after the format, so if I just say format.html, it will do the default thing that Rails always does in your controller actions if you don't call render or redirect, which is try to find a view corresponding to the controller action. If I want to do something different, I can put these curly braces after the format. Then I can put my own Ruby code in here. And what you generally do for a JSON API is you say render JSON colon and the object you want to render to JSON. So in this case, I would say at todos, right? You can use this in any controller action. It could be in an index, it could be in a show, create, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry? For some reason they do it in create, but not the other ones, but yeah. So this is like, when we're talking about, I want my Rails app to work as an API, This is the one thing you need to remember, is this response method. Once you've done that, it is an API. As far as everything minus rendering the views go, like rendering out the response to the client, all the rest of the stuff is the same. Creating things is still exactly the same. It's just the format that you want to send information back to the person using your site. Does that make sense to everyone? Cool. Okay. So now if I refresh this, I'm still getting my stuff. I get slightly different output just because, you know, the JSON JBuilder is rendering out different things, but, you know, it is kind of the same thing at the end of the day. All right. So now let's go back to HTML. And I have my to-dos list. So this is something that I would like to replace with a nice React component that's going to give me more interactivity and all that kind of stuff. So React Rails, it's pretty simple. There's just a couple steps that you need to do. So from a bash command line, if you remember, when we typed in Rails generate, we had two different things that React set up. So there's an install, already shut up and set up. And there's this React component. And this is just a shortcut to create a React component in your application. So I could say Rails generate React component, and I give it a name. So in my case, I'm going to call it to do app. It really doesn't matter as long as you remember what that name is. And when I hit enter, it's going to generate one file. It's going to generate to do app.js.jsx. And JS just means this is a JavaScript file. JSX is the thing that allows us, remember with React, we can kind of embed HTML inside our React components. The JSX extension is what it allows you to do. You don't have to worry about it too much. As long as you use Rails generated React component, it'll do it for you and everything's great. So let's take a look at this file and see what it made for us. So I'm going to go back to Sublime Text. And inside app, assets, JavaScript components, to do app.js.jsx. Already set up are basically our skeleton of our class. So we have our to app, and it's sort of defined as React.create class. So that's what we saw when we were setting stuff up in the last class, right? You have this React.create class, which is the thing that's sort of like initializing your component. And then you have the render method. The render method is basically, you know, show me what this component looks like what is the HTML for this particular component. So I'm just going to replace this with some HTML stuff. And I'm going to start off really easy. I'm just going to put a header. I'm going to say my to-do app. Just to basically get something there. We're basically at hello world level at this point. Of just basically, here's a really, really simple component that doesn't do all that much. I'm going to save that. Now our component's defined. We actually have to have a render inside our Rails app, right? We've just sort of defined the component, but we haven't sort of put it anywhere. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to that index view, because that's where I want to show up. So if I go to to-dos index, and right now this is rendering out a bunch of stuff in ERB, right? I'm going to replace that with my React component. So I'm going to delete all of this. And I'm going to get rid of this link too. And React Rails gives you one method that you need to know inside your views, which is React_component. And I'm just going to give it the name. So to-do app. This is basically saying render the to-do app React component at this location, right? If I save that, I refresh my to-dos list, I get my to-do app. So the component is actually different. Any questions so far in terms of the overall setup? This all makes sense? Cool. So let's try actually putting our to-dos in here, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is, remember when we talked about React last time, there's two important things, pieces of information to remember whenever you're dealing with React. So there's props, which is information being passed into this component, and then there's state, which is information that this component controls and can change. Because this is the to-do application component, And I'm potentially going to want to change to-do items in here. I'm going to want to add new to-do items. I'm going to want to complete to-do items. I want that to be in state, right? So anytime you need to add something to state, there's a couple things you need to do. Number one, you have to make a method called getInitialState. I'm going to say getInitialState and define that function. And this just needs to return like an empty version or an initial version of the state. And for now, I'm actually going to return some fake to-do items in here. I'll show you how to get real to-do items from the server in just a second. But for now, I'm just going to return. You always return an object, and then that object has a bunch of keys. So I'm going to return to-dos. This is kind of like initializing a hash, right? My to-dos is going to be an array, because I have a lot of different to-dos, right? And then I'm going to put a couple items in here, just as like sample data. I'm going to say name is mow the lawn. I'm going to give these IDs. Again, I'm just making stuff up right now. Like I'm just putting sample things in here. But I'm going to try to mimic what my models actually look like on Rails, so that when I actually incorporate real models into this, I won't have to change anything, right? So I'm going to set up two to-dos, one with an ID of 1 and one with an ID of 2. Out the trash. Maybe I'll make this one completed already. Now we've set up our initial state, so the state that our application starts with. And basically what I'm going to do here is anytime I want to use JavaScript code inside the linear method, I'm going to put a single curly brace, right? And you can think of that kind of like doing angle bracket % equals in Ruby. This is kind of the equivalent in React. Once I do that, I can put any JavaScript code I want in here. And basically what I want to do is I want to iterate over all of my to-dos inside my state and render them out to the screen. So what I'm going to say is to-dos map. Map, remember, is kind of like it's going to iterate through each one of them and run the code inside the function that you pass to it for each one of your to-dos. Oh, sorry. I don't actually say to-dos here. I want to say this.state.todos. So you always start with this, and you put state, and then the element you want to use, right? So that's going to match with this. Any questions on that? Does that all make sense? Cool. And then inside my map, I'm going to return, right? Because I'm calling a function, so I need to return something from that function. Unlike Ruby, where you could just put like what you wanted to return directly, in JavaScript, you always have to put the word return when you're calling a function. It's kind of frustrating. So I'm going to say return li, then I'm going to include to-do.name. Right now, I'm just rendering out the name of the to-do. I'm going to wrap this whole thing in a list element. Basically, my component now is I have a header, I have a list of items, and then iterating through my to-dos, and I'm rendering one list item for each one of my to-dos. Everyone with me? And if I were to refresh this, here, I'm going to do this so you guys can see both at the same time. If I were to reload this, you can now see that I'm rendering out those two to-do items. But those are just made up data. I'm not actually getting those from the server, right? Ideally, what I want to do is I want to call the API that already exists in my server, because we saw that when I went to-dos.json. And I want that to populate this list of to-dos rather than it being hard-coded inside my list here, right? So I'm going to change getInitialState to just have to-dos be an empty array, because I want to grab that information from my server. And then I need to use one new method. So we're going to learn another React method. And it's called component did mount. It's a really awkward name. basically what it does is, this is code that will run whenever your component is attached to a page, right? So you can think of this as sort of like a initializer, a thing that sets up your component when it first loads. So right now, if I were to refresh the page, it's still going to work, but I don't have any to-do items because it's just this empty array. So I want to put some code in here that's actually going to reach out to my server, get all of those to-dos from the API, and modify the state of my application to list off those to-dos, right? So I'm going to use jQuery in here. And there's a jQuery method whenever you want to access an API called getJSON. Basically what that means is I want to make a GET request, and I want it to return JSON to me. So it does two things. It makes a request, and it sets that accept header to JSON so that I'm getting the right sort of data back. The first argument to get JSON is the URL I want to grab it from. So I'm just going to put to-dos here, right? That's the route that I have set up in my application. And then the second argument is a method that's going to be called when that returns. It sends an argument with that, which is data, right? Data is going to be an array of my actual to-dos. So what I can do here is I want to change the state of my application. To-dos at this point is just an empty array, right? I want to change that so that it matches the data I'm getting back from my server. So what I'm going to say here is, and this is the annoying part. Because we're in a function, this is that thing where if I call this here, this won't be equal to my component. And I have to call a method called setState on my component. If I call this, it's going to be something else in this case. So before I do this, I need to say var component equals this, or var that equals this. That was the thing we were running into that last time. I wish I had a way of explaining like why. It's super confusing. It's a pain in the ass. You will forget it. If you run into problems with this, like if you're ever using this and you run into problems, this is probably the problem that you're running into, is you need to put it in a variable before you get into this sort of thing. Like whenever you have a method that gets a function passed to it, you'd call this like a callback method. And you should assume that this will change whenever you have a callback method. So I'm putting component into a variable so that I could use it inside here. Here I'm going to say component.setState. And I am basically going to say I want you to set the to-dos on my state equal to the data that was just returned from my server, right? And once I have that, and I refresh the page here, you can see that we actually got our information back. But this is a little bit different. It's not just hard-coded. It's actually reaching out to my API, grabbing the information from my API, and excuse me, rendering it on the page. And kind of the cool thing about React is we didn't have to tell it to re-render, or we didn't have to put any like funny code to say like, here's what should happen when you get the new things. You need to add this DOM element. Our render function just basically says, given certain state, here's what my application should look like. And as long as you change that state, everything will like update itself.
I was able to get that to work for that class.
Before the component.setState?
Yeah.
Probably because your get initial state still has sample data in it. Yeah. Does this make a bit more sense on how we could use it this way? Like once a server is actually involved, React starts to seem a little more sane. And again, like some of the cool things. So I don't know, do we want to take this further? Do we want to talk about adding a to-do item? It's not too bad. Let's talk about it really quickly. So let's add in here the ability to add a to-do item. So what I'm going to add is I'm going to add I'm going to make it a list item, just so it kind of like matches. So after my map, so this is listing all the existing to-do items. I'm going to create something else for adding a new to-do item. So I'm going to add one more li. And I'm going to say input type equals text. And I'm going to give it a ref. So remember, ref is what we need to add whenever we need to refer to this inside React. So we're going to have React code that's going to refer to this input type text. I'm going to call it new to do. You can think of it like name, kind of, right? So like in HTML, you would have input name. Input ref is kind of the equivalent in React, right? And I'm going to call it placeholder is add a new item. Then under that input type text, I'm going to have button and add. I'm just setting up sort of the UI for this. I'll say button type button. And if I refresh this, I can see I have add a new item now. But there's no functionality attached to it. I can type stuff in here and hit add, and nothing really happens, right? So what we want to do now is we want to make it so that whenever I click on this button, it's actually going to call out to my server and add a new to-do item to the list. So what we want to do is attach a onClick to this button. So the way that you do that is you say onClick, you do your curly braces, and then you give it a method name. The method name could be anything, but it's a method that you need to define inside your component. So I'm going to say this dot add to do. And then I need to define that function. So here I'm going to say add to do. And then inside this method, we basically want to reach out to our server and add a new to-do item, right? So what we're going to call in here is we're going to call another jQuery thing. So if you say $.post, that's a way of posting information to the server, right? So I'm going to say post to to-dos. And then the second argument is the data you want to pass, right? So let's get our data set up. I'm going to say var data equals, or sorry, I'm going to say var input. So I'm going to basically grab this particular text element. So the way that we do that is we say this.refs.new to do. And then you have to say get DOM NODE. It's a lot to memorize, but the easiest way is just memorize. Whenever you need to like reference an element, so this.refs, the name of the reference, and then get DOM node. Sorry?
React has included this Rails.
I'm not really sure.
Okay. If it's newer Rails, then we need to get back to its own way.
You just call new to do, and that's it?
They moved it.
Okay.
I don't know which version.
Let's try it out. This may be
It may or
simpler.
may not work. I don't know
They
which
actually
version.
changed this. I think get DOM node is still safe, but it's deprecated.
It's deprecated. The version they just released today has the version.
Okay, let's try doing it without, and we might get lucky. We'll see how it goes.
This was not updated, this React Rails has not been updated in 20 days.
So it's probably a version that you don't need to use it, but it's, anyway,
It's probably safe to use it.
ignore the get DOM node. You don't need it. Just this.refs.new to do. So we're going to post to to-dos, and then we're going to send the data that we want to send, right? So here we need to supply data for a to-do. So you always want to say, whenever you're posting to a Rails server, right? You want to include the key name, because that's how your controllers are working, right? When we set up our forms, it's always the name of the model, and then there's sort of a nested object inside there. The same way we had our inputs that were something like to-do name like that. It means that you need to have a nested hash. So you're going to say to-do, and I'm going to say name is input.value. And I'm going to say completed is false, because that hasn't been completed yet, right? Then what I'm going to do is, after it's done, so I'm just going to look up the jQuery syntax, because I may have got it wrong. URL data success. Okay. So the third argument to post, sorry. I don't know. You might need to look at that. The third argument is the function that should be called when it's successful. And it's going to return data as well. right? And what I want to do is kind of the same thing. Well, what it's going to return, so this is up to your server. This is basically data is going to include the JSON data that's being returned from your server. And by default in Rails, or the way that it's typically set up, is that's going to return information about that one particular to-do item. So what I want to do in this case is I want to add that to-do item to my state, right? So here, I'm going to say, and again, I need to get my component into a variable. I'm going to say component.setState. I'm going to say to-dos, and it's going to be this, component dot to-dos dot concat, which means add an element to the array, and data. So I'm basically saying, take the to-dos, component.state.to-dos, take the to-dos that are already in my state, and add the data that was returned into that state. And when we try this out, I've almost certainly got something wrong, but let's try it. It might be. No, but it wouldn't. Sorry, one sec. So it did add it, but I've got something wrong here. Cannot read property name of undefined. This .refs is not working?
Well, it's name, property name of undefined. You access name.
Oh, okay, you know what? It is my data type problem. So this is kind of the problem that we've run into before, where jQuery is not, you need to tell it that you want to use JSON as your data type, and that's the fourth argument. So I need to say, I want to get JSON back, because right now it's sending JS back and trying to execute that. So I'm passing my data, my function. Sorry, it's hard to see it from here. And I can't make that small. I just have a syntax error, I just have to figure it out. Oh, this is probably wrong. Sorry, I just had a typo there. And then when I add that, sorry about that. So now basically what's happening is it's sending an index request to my server, right? It's including information about it to do. And basically when I get a response back, which is going to be the information about the to-do I just added, we're resetting the state on my component to include the new to-do that I've added to the system. Does everyone kind of get the flow of that, how that's working? Is basically what you want to do is just send the request to your server. Then when you get a successful response back, just modify your state to reflect the change that just happened. And again, that's kind of the cool thing about React, is I don't have to tell it to re-render. I don't need to manipulate nodes. My render function just needs to take into account, here's what I should look like when my state changes. And React will take care of, okay, here's how I'm going to re-render my application to reflect sort of the new to-do item that's been added, right? If you were thinking about doing this in sort of traditional Rails, you would have to, where you're getting the callback from your function, you would need to be like adding DOM nodes and manipulating them and kind of keeping things in sync. Whereas here, I can just say, re-render the entire thing and figure out what it should look like. Sorry about the confusion there. It's always, live coding is always tricky. But the key thing to remember is, attach these events. When those events fire, modify your server, and then when you get a successful response back, modify your state, and everything will stay in sync, right? And if I refresh, My app is always going to be in sync. So it's really nice in that respect. I have to close this if I do that.
Close your sidebar. You
Oh,
can
yeah.
Command and KB.
Command what?
Command KB. It's all pretty much gone now, but.
There you go. I'll post this up to GitHub, but I'm going to stop it there. The completed thing, you could imagine it would be the same sort of approach. You would just need to update one of your to-dos to set as completed to true or false, right? But it's the same idea at the end of the day. You're using jQuery to make those requests to your server and then modifying your state when it comes back successfully. Any questions on that? Cool. React, play with it, practice it. The hardest thing to get your head around is sort of state and props and how to deal with them. Once you have that down, things get a lot simpler, but it can be a bit weird when you start off with it because it's very different from normal JavaScript development. Any other questions? Any other completely unrelated things people would like me to go over, or should we do final projects now? I think I've probably filled your brains enough. Let's do a bit of final project time. And yeah, cool. We're around if you have questions.
Does that it's highlighting. You can ignore it. See it. It's all JavaScript.
We just upgraded to 14.
Yeah.
Except you haven't fixed much better than
See ya.